Historians say that nothing unifies society as much as a war. The war in Ukraine is mean and disguised. The aggressor guises it, covers it with the words of peace and brotherhood. And only Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, Gundyaev, openly called the conflict in the east of Ukraine the holy war of Russian Orthodoxy against the Ukrainian Uniates and schismatics. That is why almost all chaplains in the Ukrainian army belong to the Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of the Kyiv Patriarchate, and only a few priests there on the front line belong to the Patriarchate of Moscow, but there are too many of them in the separatist camp. Can society be united in the face of an external enemy if almost half of our Orthodox brothers and sisters pray in the temples for the health and the well-being of the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, Gundyaev? The Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine is large and influential, and the unity of Ukrainian Orthodoxy cannot be said without taking into account the opinions of those of our citizens who are under the home of the Moscow Patriarchate. People who know say that the situation is not so critical. Actually, there are not so many fanatics of Russian imperialism in this church, although they take the upper hand over the majority of the flock there. But even the church created on the basis of the Lavra, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, also did not follow the scenario that was devised in Moscow. I talked with many representatives of their clergy, and they all took a predominantly patriotic position. And we formed this position together with the state institutions, together with the old church community, together with the Council of Churches. Such a format made it possible to effectively interact with the state and the church. So even the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate was one of the powerful pillars of support for Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian spirituality. Experts in church affairs also consider this version of the association as promising, when they do not focus on one church but will try to unite parts of all Orthodox churches. And it is necessary on the basis of this principle, when every priest, whether he is from the Kyiv Patriarchate or from the Moscow Patriarchate or from the autocephalous church, that they all preserve their parishes and will be subordinated to a single territorial center in Kyiv. Those who do not want to do this will be deemed representatives of foreign churches, but negotiations on unification must be conducted with all three Orthodox churches. The recent Council of Orthodox Churches also showed that the hierarchs of churches have a desire for unity. However, there are a lot of obstacles that have already entered the tradition. Moreover, certain dogmas are being developed and finalized even today, and they hinder unification processes. But I say again, between the Ukrainian Orthodox churches, there is an understanding that when it comes to statehood, there are no barriers between them. It should be noted that since the time of Viktor Yushchenko's presidency, numerous attempts have been made to obtain the status of the local church by Ukrainian Orthodoxy. But these attempts were made mainly by administrative methods through negotiations at the top, without attracting the opinion of the general public. First of all, negotiations were conducted with the ecumenical patriarch about granting autocephaly to our Orthodoxy. However, the Patriarch of Constantinople always drew the attention of Ukrainian officials to one simple thing. They say, which of the Orthodox churches should be granted autocephaly if you have three of them? That is why the church unity of all branches of Orthodoxy in Ukraine will be the first prerequisite for the recognitions regarding our local church. All bureaucratic actions, even those of the late Secretary of State Alexander Zinchenko, the head of the presidential administration Ivan Vasiunik, the head of the presidential administration Ivan Vasiunik, then the head of the administration Viktor Baloha, who traveled to the ecumenical patriarch and then invited him on the state level to Ukraine, were doomed to failure. Without a real foundation in the Orthodox environment and without the real participation Of all Orthodox churches, no bureaucratic, unofficial decisions from the ecumenical patriarch have been made. And this is strange. After all, Constantinople understands that in Ukraine the unification of Orthodox churches began, that all of them should be equal, and that the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church and the Kyiv Patriarchate were recognized canonical officially and categorically. This is because in their current status, there are schismatics for the Moscow Patriarchate Church, and for them only one way is possible: to repent and return to the bosom of the Russian Church. So as long as this position will be held by the hierarchs of the Moscow Patriarchate, there is no point in dreaming about Orthodox unity. Although some of the senior government intelligence officials informed that private, unofficial negotiations of Ukrainian churches with the UOC-MP have been conducted repeatedly, and the clergy in the Ukrainian parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate often demonstrated a completely different opinion than that which the UOC-MP officially proclaims. The negotiation process began. It was a complicated, unofficial process. Here, there was the issue of canonicity. But for that period, the wisdom of Metropolitans Vladimir and Methodius from the Moscow Patriarchate allowed them to come to the conclusion that these negotiations should be conducted. Despite some special statuses, and despite the fact that Moscow decided to anathematize Patriarch Philaret, all this was then discarded, and a model was produced that led not only to dialogue, but also to a concrete solution of problems. And even the most powerful adherents of Moscow, these were representatives of the UOC MP Mykolaiv, Odessa, Crimea. After serious personal conversations with them, they agreed. Nevertheless, at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, Russia began to force anti-Ukrainian hysteria. Many jokes began to appear about stupid, ignorant Ukrainians. There were myths that Ukraine was stealing Russian gas, and it was said that Ukraine is almost like a woman being supported by Russian money. The Russian Orthodox Church was also forced to join this political game on the side of the Kremlin. In 2001, the Congress of Slavic Peoples was held, which was welcomed, among other things, by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. They made very important decisions regarding the policy of the Russian Orthodox Church in the so-called canonical territories, where this church exists. They declared the restoration of a single economic and political space, the introduction of a single spirituality, which is carried by the Russian Orthodox Church to the entire United Slavic people, to which they clearly relegated Great Russians, Belarusians, and Malorus, that is, Ukrainians. The memorandum of that Congress directly stated the following: the role of the Russian Orthodox Church is uniting and supporting the fraternal unity of the laity, and the clergy is particularly important in our time. In the entire post-Soviet space, divided into subjects, clearly alludes to those states that arose on the ruins of the collapsed USSR. So in the entire post-Soviet space divided into subjects, only the Russian Orthodox Church operates in all regions as a single spiritual force and a single organization. These traditional functions of the Church have not taken on a new meaning. It is clear that this meaning is the translation of Russian culture and behind stands Russian policy. In fact, at that Congress, the Russian Orthodox Church assumed obligations of which it was completely incompetent and which were not among the functions of the Church. But this commitment, the Russian Orthodox Church, has shown itself to be one of the state institutions of the Russian Federation. Thus, the hierarchs of the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine found themselves between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, their direct leadership from Moscow demands to maintain a pro-Russian position. On the other hand, the majority of believers are firmly on the ground of Ukrainian statehood and independence. Metropolitan Volodymyr Sabadan, with all his authority, restrained pro-Russian activists from among the flock and especially from among the clergy. He several times began negotiations with the Kyiv Patriarchate. Some believe that he paid a heavy price for all his efforts. I knew very well the late, the holiest Volodymyr Sabadan. I know that today's society has not yet received an answer to the question of how he was taken out. We pray for people to discover the truth, namely, that the death of Metropolitan Volodymyr of Kyiv was a murder. This was a murder, and the culprits must pay for their actions according to human laws. Well, in fact, according to God. And who was behind this? So the murder of Metropolitan Volodymyr was the first act in the attack against Ukraine. Perhaps the first act, but not the last one. With the advent of Vladimir Putin to power in Russia, the aggressiveness of the foreign policy of the neighboring country has been intensively growing. And at the same time, Russian ultra-right organizations are beginning to teach the public to adhere to new cults of personality. They started with the return from the forgetfulness of the cult of the bloody dictator Joseph Stalin. Then another cult of no less bloody ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, appeared. And then it was quite easy to introduce the cult of Putin himself. And interestingly enough, the Russian Orthodox Church actively participates in all this.
Оскільки вони останнім часом починають робити
Since they recently began making icons with portraits of Stalin, they not only started to consecrate them in churches, but are also praying to them.
Вони також і моляться на них.
With their believers fall before the image of Stalin on their knees and cross themselves, then it seems that the Russian Orthodox Church ceases to be canonical.
Антихриста. То створюється таке враження, що Російська Православна Церква взагалі перестає бути канонічною.
In 2010, a similar icon was consecrated in the Kyiv Patriarchate. The author of this creation is the artist and blogger Alexander Volodarsky. And in the village of Bolshaya Yelnya, in the Nizhny Novgorod region, even the sect of the Witnesses of Putin is operating. They really pray for their president there. The adequate majority in Russia consider it a curiosity. However, Vladimir Putin himself is not in a hurry to close this sect, even though he approved the banning of several dozen non-traditional religious organizations in recent years. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, maybe a place in the assembly of Orthodox saints is being prepared for Vladimir Putin, just the way it was for Tsar Nicholas the Bloody. The question is rhetorical. The Russian Empire was built on the principles of autocracy, nationality, and orthodoxy. And today's Kremlin leaders realize that it is possible to restore the Russian Empire on these principles. And the religious factor, the Orthodox factor, plays a key role here. The mission of the state here is very delicate, since it is a very subtle matter. So the mission of the state is to communicate with believers and explain to them the essence of those processes that used to take place and which are happening now.
Людина, яка очолювала 4 роки комісію по вивченню
As a man who once headed the Parliamentary Commission for studying the political and legal situation in the Crimea, I want to say that in the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the Russian occupation authorities have done everything to stop any activity of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They abused priests and they prevented Ukrainians from attending their churches, and they're hindering them now.
І перешкоджають зараз.
But this is not the most important thing. The fact is that the formerly independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate actually recognized its Crimean churches as the property of the Russian Church, and even made changes to its charter. Now 2 dioceses, Feodosia and Simferopol, are officially reassigned from the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate to the Russian Orthodox Church. Their property also became the property of the Russian Church, even that property into which the Ukrainian state has heavily invested.
Чому я починав відновлювати храм?
Why did I begin to restore the temple of the Saint Vladimir in Khersones? And now they bless Vladimir Putin, the murderer of our people. Why are they serving for Putin? We rebuilt the temple and we invested our money, time, efforts, and minds into it. We have done everything we could, But it turns out that now all this is backfiring against us and is only strengthening the Russian aggressor.
Підсилює агресора.
Over the past few years, as long as the war with Russia continues, the faithful of the Moscow Patriarchate have been massively going to the guardianship of Kyiv. And this cannot be stopped. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church will be in Ukraine, as well as freedom of religion. However, it will be called Russian, not Ukrainian. And vice versa. The Ukrainian Church will be united, both in name and in spirit. But we'll talk about this in the next program. In the meantime, remember that each phenomenon has its good and bad sides. It's pro and contra.